Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, these have been difficult times. While we cannot lose sight of how the whole world reels under the impact that we are facing now, but it has also brought us closer to our families, our hobbies, ourselves. For me, the silver lining of this lockdown has been the time and opportunity to catch up on a lot of reading. And since nationalism is very dear to my heart, numerous books about the impact of British colonial rule, the extent to which the British hurt the Indian economy, gory examples of how they incapacitated, for example, the weavers of Bengal who made fine muslin by charging them a tax at 80%, destroying their looms, mutilating their thumbs, thereby eventually killing the textile industry. This has been very well evidenced in the book Considerations on India Affairs by William Boltz, who was a Dutch trader who visited India during the 17th century. Similarly, I came to know about the Indian shipbuilding industry that had awed the European seafarers as early as the 13th century. Accounts reveal that when Marco Polo visited India in 13 something, he saw large Indian ships carrying boats with as many as 60 cabins, 14 watertight compartments. The technological feat of these ships were cutting edge. They had a degree of advancement which was not even achieved by Europe for the next 2 centuries. Even during Britain's imperial century and its global naval supremacy, Indian shipbuilding was regarded as of the highest quality. Its artisans built ships like the composite brig Fame as late as the 1880s. But by the early 1900s, the Indian ship industry, like its weaving counterpart, was a sad remnant of its glorious past, having been systematically destroyed by the British. And while pre-colonial India engaged in 27% of global trade, it had dropped to less than 2% post-independence. The steel, for instance, that was made indigenously in the smelters in India was qualitatively superior to that produced in Sheffield. The London Bridge, which is an symbol of the Pax Britannica, was constructed largely with the steel from India. No wonder then it hasn't fallen since then, because the poem that we used to sing as children, London Bridge is Falling Down, is of the times in the early 12th and 13th century when the London Bridge used to keep falling every now and then, but not after they have used the Indian steel. So this drop of 27 to 2% trade has been very well summarized by John Sullivan, who was a colonial administrator and who founded the British settlement in Ooty, who said that the Englishman flourishes and acts like a sponge, drawing up riches from the banks of the Ganges and squeezing them down upon the banks of the Thames. The British damaged the socioeconomic fabric of our country so extensively, diminishing us from world producers and exporters of luxury products to meek importers of British goods. Their regressive economic policies made us lag behind industrial Europe for hundreds of years. Socially, they sliced and diced our immeasurable diversity to a form which could be conceived by them and which is to their advantage. And in the process, They caused a lot of problems to India. But then, when I was reading this, I heaved a sigh of relief that all this was so devastating. Thank God it was in the past and it is over. Today, we are politically independent. We are ruled by our fellow Indians. And through our democracy, we, the people, govern ourselves. We deserve to be proud of ourselves. Yet, I cannot but see the stark resemblance between the Firangi Sahibs of yore, parading the streets of India in their fancy cars, followed by their grand entourages and receiving the servile salutes every now and then, and the men of today who, although brown-skinned, rule us. We are politically independent, yet governed by the European mind, still ashamed to be unabashedly embracing of our indigenous ways of living, still embarrassed of our own socio-cultural identity, of our beliefs and thoughts, lacking the confidence to find our own solutions to these problems. We look outward for everything, even to define ourselves. Even after 73 years of independence, we are not free. We are colonized in our minds. How? You may ask. Well, one doesn't have to look too hard to find the symptoms everywhere. Let's take some examples. For 52 years, from 1947 to 1999, our union budget used to be presented at 5 p.m. Do you know why? Because that was the tradition during the colonial period, as 5 p.m. in India was midday at the House of Commons in the British Parliament in London. It took us 52 years to question it. And for the first time in 1999, during Vajpayeeji's government, 52 years after we made a famous Tryst with Destiny, for the first time, we shifted it to 11 a.m. Let's take the example of the Indian Administrative Service, another remnant of the colonial past, which continues to be increasingly constrictive, both to the officers as well as to the citizens. A feature characteristically colonial, the Indian Civil Services was instituted by the Government of India Act in 1858, appointing the elite, educated Scots and Englishmen to regulate and control the vast territories of the subcontinent. Rarely were Indians given an equal playground in the services. They were kept away from the critical loci of power. The overwhelming white man's burden of civilizing the natives inherently instituted a system of bureaucratic red tapeism, viewing every Indian not as a citizen, but a potentially pestilential entity. And while such minions of the empire were deployed to India, Britain itself remained free from such a restrictive setup. It isn't very surprising that these colonial attitudes have pervaded contemporary bureaucratic attitudes as well, which, I dare say, very much mimic the obstructive and non-cooperative ways of functioning to this day, riddled with corruption and temporal egotism. When are we going to take a relook at the very Indian administrative services and see whether we need it or not? Because none of the developed nations have such a system. It is a colonial remnant, and it is time we took a hard look at it, knowing very well where this bureaucracy helps and where it hinders. Let's move on to other examples. 70% of India lives in villages, and out of these, 60% live in mud homes. Have we questioned till date that even after 70 years of independence, why do not we have a school of mud architecture to cater to this need indigenously? Instead, what do we see? The new India, be it the newly made Gurgaon or some parts of Bangalore, we see the monstrous and ugly buildings with glass exteriors. Glass, a direct cut copy paste from the temperate countries of Europe or US, where it is cold. So they do need glass to trap the heat. But what has glass to do in a tropical country like India, where at 40 degrees in summers with glass facades, we trap the heat, take it to another 60 degrees, and then we fix ACs to bring down the temperatures to 20 degrees, thereby burning fossil fuel 2 times over. Can we imagine Europeans or Americans wearing a dhoti in the freezing winters in their countries and burning fossil fuel to keep the temperatures of their homes at a sizzling 35 degrees? Or trying to learn Hindi in its every nuance and pronunciation and chiding their children who are fluent in English to polish their Hindi instead? Sounds absurd, doesn't it? But why does it not sound absurd when we, in the Indian summers of 40 degrees, wear three-piece suits and then maintain the temperatures of our homes and offices again at those freezing 18-degree temperatures? Why don't we find it absurd that we find it fashionable to teach our children in English at the expense of Hindi or their mother tongue? It is inferiority complex to not know English in this country. Now, since we have come to this topic of English, let us take it a little deeper. We proudly say that India has the second largest English-speaking population in the world. So 123 million Indians speak English. Well, the number might sound huge when you see it in absolute terms, but compared to the 1.3 billion population, it is just 10%. But the higher education, the courts, the High Court, the Supreme Court, everything is in English. What about the balance 90%? Are we not deliberately creating a glass ceiling and keeping 90% of our brothers and sisters in artificially made system which does not allow them to grow? Have we ever thought that if we were to impose Hindi in UK or US, where suddenly their kids have to write their 10th grade exams in a Hindi or do their higher education in Hindi, where would that take them? With all this smartness, they would not be able to express themselves. Most of us would flunk if we were asked to write our exams in French or Spanish or Mandarin for that matter. But most of our brothers and sisters, 90% of them, struggle with English, who are native at the expense of their mother tongue or other languages that they are comfortable with. Well, now we may say that it is necessary for our economy. It's necessary for our GDP. Let's take a quick look at the top 20 countries in the world. The top 20 countries with the highest GDP. They are countries like Switzerland, Norway, United States, Denmark, Singapore, Sweden, Australia, Netherlands, Austria, and so on. And what we find is that the mass language is the same as the official language. If the mass language in Switzerland is German, French, and Italian, all three are the official languages. So the mother tongue of the child is the official language. Let us take this argument further. Let us look at the bottom 20 GDP countries in the world. And they would be Uganda, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Madagascar, Mozambique, Burundi, Malawi. Do you find something common with them? Yes, they were all erstwhile colonies. But the comparison does not end there. In these countries, the mass language and the official language is different, like in India. If the mass language is Swahili in Burundi, it is French, the official language. Now, you may say that correlation does not prove causality, that they are not the bottom 20 just because the official language is not their mother tongue. So correlation may not prove causality, but it shows us that the idolatry of the colonial language is often accompanied by the rejection of one's own mother tongue. And this sense of inferiority of one's language and culture compared to one's masters is the beginning, erstwhile masters, is the beginning of the erosion of self-respect, self-esteem, and eventually the self-confidence of any race. It is no doubt surprising then that most of our engineers, after they finish their education, they want to go abroad for jobs. Everybody is looking to settle abroad. And that is what we call success here. We have Bollywood showcasing the rich and elite as English speakers and the downtrodden as Hindi speakers. We are happy when Slumdog Millionaire wins Oscars, but our sense of self-respect has been so blunted that we do not even see the cultural stereotyping that the movie seems to be doing when it endorses poverty, squalor, and backwardness. We are okay to be made fun of internationally. Now, why is it important to remember these examples? What are these the symptoms of? So if we look closer and go deeper, we will find that these are the symptoms of an inferiority complex. Our total mental and intellectual dependence on and subordination to the West. And mind you, this dependence is not technological or financial, but invades all aspects of our life, social, collective, individual. We try to fashion even our food, our sense of dressing, our forms of entertainment after them. Every Italian loves his pizza and every Chinese his staple food. But we are the first to jettison chawal and roti in favor of other cuisines in a hoard to belong to that perceived eliteness. Even though Indian food, based on the Ayurvedic insights, may be the most healthy and holistic. A fallout of this mentality is the need for ratification from outside, especially the West, for everything. Yoga needs to come back from the West to gain acceptance and respect in its homeland. We need a Schumacher to tell us that small is beautiful before we take our cottage industries as examples of sustainable entrepreneurship. We need a Miyawaki or a Fukuoka to teach us about planting local species without chemical fertilizers and regain a confidence about agricultural practices, which I'm sure we once championed. A colonized mind lacks the confidence to build technologies that it requires itself, and so eventually loses them. It was aspirational to replace the tropical climate-appropriate fine muslin, cloth and khadi by machine-done cheap polyester fabric made in the UK. Even after so many years, and India being one of the leading IT producers, we do not have a single brand of hardware or software which we use. I'm very proud that some of our fellow Indians are CEOs in these top companies like Google and Microsoft. But what about being owners of these companies? What about being entrepreneurs and building products? in IT rather than just being the backyard of the West. Secondly, this also points towards concepts which are repackaged with a Western cover before we start taking cognizance of them. Let's take the example of psychology. Western psychology is the study of the outer personality of man and is essentially behavioral. Indian psychology is more concerned with the inner man, the study of consciousness. The sad state of affairs today is that while the West is interested in the studies of consciousness and has taken it to another level, and are coining words like transpersonal psychology, our students in India are still learning the psychology of Freud or Jung and Pavlov or Skinner. And because of this, a vicious spiral is created. The British designed education system that we follow, as we all know, was aimed at creating, as per Macaulay's letter, a class of people who will be Indian in their looks and appearance, but English in their outlook. They would be the bridge between what the Britishers wanted to do with the rest of India. This English-speaking elite was at the helm in most positions during the British Raj and continues even now after 70 years of independence. Now, this category is looked up by the rest of the non-English speaking India, and this creates a vicious cycle. We are losing touch with our roots. Giving up our native languages in favor of the colonizer's language, says the Kenyan award-winning author of the book Decolonizing the Mind, has a detrimental impact on the native culture because the foreign language brings with it its own values and symbols, most of which are alien to the native thought and milieu. For instance, for the want of a better word, Sanatan Dharma, Christian Hinduism, only through a process of philosophical othering by the Islamic invaders in the 11th century, with Islam or Christianity, does justice to neither the former nor the latter. There is no concept of religion. There's no word equivalent to religion in India. The word is dharma, which has a very deeper connotation. But when we start viewing ourselves through the lens of the colonizers, we start reshaping our ideas through their language and their lens and their values and their symbols. And this is something which is done deliberately to colonize. For instance, literature is created where the colonized is shown as inferior and an illusory cultural hegemony is constructed so that the colonizers can rule with the consent of the oppressed. For instance, literature abounds with instances of racial superiority of whites over browns, religious superiority of Christians over native religions. And all this is done very innocently and matter-of-factly. Culture stereotyping is done like showing India as a country of snake charmers and elephants, seen for instance in books like Around the World in 80 Days and films like the Indiana Jones franchise. Complex ideologies and beliefs are ridiculously simplified, rendering them often to become some incomprehensible mumbo jumbo. And these constructs are not just circulated in the West, but come back to their colonies, make the people start believing in them, and chip away at their self-esteem. The interpretation of the outsiders, of inside matters, without an idea of what they stand for is another danger. Like the interpretation of the Vedas in the completely materialistic way by the European scholars, and making it a pastoral allegory where farm animals like cows and horses abound. Whereas these were images of a very deeper symbolism, which is completely missed by them. As a result of this, there is loss of indigenous knowledge. Whether it is modern medicine wiping out Ayurveda or indigenous methods of agriculture and forestry, we are losing our ancient wisdom in a relentless pursuit of imitating the West. Somewhere, Jairam Ramesh had remarked that India is every year losing about 2,000 patents on traditional formations, as knowledge on them was either not documented and hence lost. Examples abound, as I said before, in how India was ahead of its European counterparts in many practices. But this systematic degeneration weakens the spirit of what India stood for. Do we know that though we credit Edward Jenner of having invented the smallpox vaccine in 1795, India was inoculating its people with the smallpox 75 years before that, in 1720. It is well documented that Lady Montague, the wife of the then British ambassador in Turkey, got her children successfully inoculated for smallpox and then started advocating its introduction in Britain. And it was only 75 years later that in 1795, Edward invented it, as they say. But if we look at it today, we would never have this pride or confidence that we were good in anything at all. Our students who study mathematics in their graduation, many of them do not even know the kind of binomial theorems, Fourier series, which Indian mathematicians had already worked upon. A simple thing like the Pythagoras theorem was in the Shalbha Sutra, already worked out by Bodhayana. Indian botanical texts were collected by the Portuguese and Dutch from the 16th century. The Horace Malabaricus, which is a 12-volume compendium, has illustrations of about 750 species of Indian plants and with their uses and medicinal benefits. It was published in Europe in the 17th century with the help of Konkani and Kerala Pandits. Similarly, the Indian agricultural implements like the drill plow and were much ahead of their European counterparts. The understanding of building material and techniques, the use of chemicals, ice making in Varanasi, the transfer of technology of plastic surgery that happened in the 1700s from Pune to London have all been very well documented by a 5 series of books by Sridhar Rampal, and we should all read it to understand the glory of where India stood. Now, here we are with partial success. We have political freedom. Why are we still not the best? Why is it that, let's say, in the world arena, when we look at our performance, be it in winning Nobel Prizes or Olympic medals, our tallies remain abysmally low. India has so far just won 9 golds, 6 silvers and 11 bronzes, a total of 26 medals in 30 Olympic Games that have happened so far. And Even though hockey has brought us 8 golds and is a national game, cricket continues to be a national obsession and dominates the imagination of this country. Again, a colonial remnant. So how do we go from here? What do we do? Where do we start? I think, for starters, we should immediately set up the much delayed Ministry of Decolonization, a department of the cabinet that should have been set up in 1947 by the Indian government when it began its era of self-governance. This ministry would look at every social, political, economic, educational aspect of our collective and individual living and ruthlessly pass it through the furnace and touchstone of contextual relevance, indigenous wisdom, in line with our social, cultural requirements and the spirit and methods essentially Indian. And then, based on this, we should come up with solutions that are innovative, suiting the Indian culture, ethos, and genius. A case in point is the adoption of the parliamentary form of democracy as a mode of governance, just because the British used this model in their country. More than 100 years ago, Sri Aurobindo said that this was not the right model for India, and it will take India 100 years to realize this truth. And prophetically so, 100 years later, 3 hung parliaments proved that how a presidential form of government with a strong grassroots panchayat level system would more suit the temperament of India. But these things have to be looked at, each one from ground zero. Each of these decisions that we took in 1947 has to be re-looked at. The 19th century India, says Sri Aurobindo, was imitative, self-forgetful, and artificial. It aimed at a successful reproduction of Europe in India, forgetting the deep saying of the Gita, better the law of one's own being, though it be badly done, than an alien dharma well followed. If a nation is imitative, imported, artificial, then whatever temporary success it may have, the nation is moving towards self-sterilization and death. He adds, if on the other hand, the peculiar individuality of a race stamps itself on the movement in its every part and seizes on every new development as a means of self-expression, then the nature wakes, lives, and grows, and whatever the revolutions and changes, it is assured of its survival and aggrandizement. We should therefore learn to think originally and recover a lost intellectual freedom and elasticity by liberating our minds. We should neither think like the foreigners nor like the orthodox pundits, says Sri Aurobindo. We have to think for ourselves afresh. Decolonizing is not believing or acting upon received thought, but coming to conclusions after a deep study oneself. There has to be a triple process of selection, rejection, and assimilation of all that is available to us in this world in line with our essential way of being. Thirdly, we should launch a massive drive towards increasing indigenous scholarship. We should rewrite history from the Indian lens. And not just Indian history, but even world history. So far, we have been made to see them as they would like us to see them and see us as again they would like us to see us. This is the pity. The history of the colonial period that we read is mostly authored by the British. And even if written by Indians, he or she inevitably turns out to be an academic from the West. It is not surprising, therefore, that till I was in my 8th grade, my books still said that 1857 was a mutiny. Yes, mutiny from British point of view, but for India, it was the first war of Indian independence. It was a very sacred war, and we continue to call it a mutiny. Secondly, we should revisit our past, recover all the manuscripts which are lying in several villages of India, some of them in bad conditions, restore them, translate them, study them, because in them exist insights in disciplines from metallurgy to forestry, from logic to linguistics, from engineering to mathematics. To reverse the process and recover what we have lost is undoubtedly the first step to which we ought to devote ourselves, says Sri Aurobindo. Having discovered what we have lost, we need to establish our own paradigms, rewrite our own narratives, meanings of words that define us based on the rich spiritual heritage that we have inherited. For instance, this whole debate on secularism to which we are dragged does not even apply to India. Secularism was a European concept because the church was opposed to the state and the individuals. Secularism in Europe meant taking property away from the church and giving it to the state. But in India, where was this divide between the sacred and the secular? Spirituality was a search for a higher living in line with the highest truth, or the concept of dharma, which was the basis of individual life, be it statecraft or science. Our rishis were astronomers, scientists, priests. They all coexisted within themselves peacefully. So why should we drag ourselves to statuses lower than ourselves and be compelled to look at ourselves from a lens which does not belong to us, does not suit us? Life was always a pursuit of truth. Science was pursuing it objectively and spirituality subjectively. There was never a discord between the two. Similarly, we should take a hard look at the entire imagery of backwardness and barbarism, which was deliberately created to destroy the confidence of the Indians. I would not go into it. There are several examples for the lack of time, but I would like to end by saying that one of the other reasons of failure was that we attempted the creation of the new industry without the inclusion of the grassroots artisans and on poor, uncomprehending imitation of the West, with the help of talent drawn from not more than 2% of our people, the English-speaking elite. To grow and to develop, we should empower the people closer to the grassroots and rebuild primary industry and economy with them. While talking about integrating the masses into the mainstream by imbuing them with the spirit of self-help and self-confidence and igniting the spirit of Swadeshi, Sri Aurobindo says that the only way in which this can be done is to destroy the barriers between the educated class and the peasantry, which the English education has created, so that we can restore the old unity of society by mutual service, by love, by self-identification with the mass of our countrymen. We should develop our own rubrics of success. We need not milk Mother Nature dry in the race for higher GDPs as an indicator of our success, which is based on productivity and consumption. Our external life has always been a reflection of that large spiritual inward living. So the measures of its success should also be our own. Here, overcoming of desire is held higher than the fulfilling of it. So how can we be judged on the same parameters like GDP? None of this would be possible without fundamental change of the national education system. Nalanda set up in 5th century BC, 1500 years ago, Oxford, had 9 million books when Bakhtiyar Khilji burnt it in 1193, and it was burning for 3 months. Oxford's main research library today has little more than 12 million books. This revival has to be in all spheres of human endeavor: the science, the arts, the technologies, the social, economic and political paradigms. Because mind, says Sri Aurobindo, is the highest instrument that man possesses of exceeding himself, the lever that can catapult him into the greatnesses that awake and beckon him. The wars today, therefore, are not fought with guns or tanks or even missiles, but subtly by mind games, by creating narratives about a country or a race that impoverish the mind and weaken the soul. India has been undergoing this colonization of the mind indirectly, along with political colonization, ever since the early 17th century, and all the more today. A colonized mind is akin to an opiumed body that has lost its sense of identity. It enters a very vicious cycle to feed off the same thing that it wishes to discard. The very crutches of information and the next dose it relies upon to survive incapacitates it of the metacognition to be self-aware, or the meta-will to give up the habit. The mirror of self-reflection has been clouded by ignorance, just as the willpower of an opium person is dimmed by the consumption of it. So therefore, a colonized mind, like an opium body, continues in its state of inertia and helplessness unless it is acted upon by a mind higher than itself, trained in independent and original thinking, intelligent reasoning, ruthless examining of all conclusions, judgments, and opinions we, as a collective, may have acquired under the opium of the narrative of the benign British Raj. And sooner she throws off the cloud of skepticism, says Amal Kiran in his essay, How Shall We Grow in Greatness? The more apt will she be to use her youthfulness for genuine growth in greatness. India of the ages is not dead, nor has she spoken her last creative word. She lives and has still something to do for herself and the human people. And that which must seek now to awake is not an anglicized Oriental people, docile people of the West, and doomed to repeat the cycle of the Occident's success and failure. But since the ancient immemorable Shakti, recovering her deepest self, lifting her head higher towards the supreme source of light and strength, and turning to discover the complete meaning and the vast reform of her dharma. I see here not Sri Aurobindo, the patriot and nationalist, in his fiery diction and incisive argumentation alone, but also Sri Aurobindo the seer, who holds Indian resurgence at the heart of a greater global transformation and evolution of life itself as a manifestation of divinity. For as we move to regain our glorious past knowledge and move to dazzling bright future, we must remember that we do none of this for ourselves or for India and of itself, but in our continuing striving towards divinity, our spiritual ascension, to which this great nation holds the key. And so, the rise of Asia is not for herself, but for a clearer and truer expression of Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram, the true, the good, and the beautiful. And for that, the first step is the decolonizing of the mind to rise to higher states. Thank you.